Right, morning, Mick. Thank you very much for joining us. Professor Mick Waters. So, Mick, you have been at the forefront of curriculum design in the UK or in England for a long, long time now. I think you're probably in the status of legendary curriculum expert, not to put any pressure on you. So, my first question is, what do you see as the biggest challenge to the curriculum in this country at the moment?
My goodness, that's a good question to start with. I think the biggest challenge is the challenge that's always been there, which is how to bridge the distance between the documents that come from central government and the point where the curriculum meets the child. So we somehow have to convince teachers that they're responsible for the curriculum with children. They're the people that make the difference. They're the people that interpret. They're the people that shape the curriculum. What government offers is an expectation of what the nation wants for its children. And it's the teacher in the school, wherever it is, whether it's in Middlesbrough or Kent, or whether it's in sunny Devon or the middle of Stoke-on-Trent. Their challenge is to make that curriculum come alive for children. And I think over the last many years now, we've gradually taken the agency away from teachers and help them to think that they've got to implement something that central government demands.
Just to stir the pot on that conversation, when government's defining that this is what we want to pass down to our educators, that we've now sort of taken that agency away, how much is looking down at what our students need versus looking up and saying, well, compared to other countries and PISA rankings, we want to be seen to be doing?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's about PISA rankings. I do think there's a tension between what the nation needs in terms of its future prospects. So what's the economy going to be like? What's the employment situation going to be? How do we make sure our nation's successful? And then alongside that, it's what does a child need in the 2020s? How do we marry together the needs of young individual children who are little growing human beings who we want to grow up to be successful, confident, mature adults who care for their own children, who help society to get better, who want to change the world for the better? How do we match the needs at primary stage or at secondary stage of youth and childhood against what the nation will need in the future? And ever since schooling began, state schooling, if you look at the Education Act of 1870, it starts off what our nation needs if it's going to be successful is. And that's why we need schooling. we can take that, I understand that, but actually schooling over generations now has taken on a role of being part carer for child, part influencer of children, part personal developer of child. So we've got to marry that, and that's why, the curriculum review that's underway at the minute has got a big challenge, because always national curriculum reviews start from the one we already have.
Yes.
And how do we change it, as opposed to saying, what's the purpose of schooling? If that's the purpose for schooling, what do we need to do? What do we need to include in a curriculum? All a curriculum is a list of content that we want our children to experience. Teaching is the thing that brings it alive.
But if we go back to 1870 and move forward, and I'm not proposing for today's discussion we travel on an annual basis through the entire cycle, is there an argument that at that point there was a much more prescriptive sense of numeracy and literacy unlocks the potential of our population wherever they may be across the Commonwealth, and actually the shift in terms of, because we always refer to what we've got, has been much slower than what we've been wanting from a labour market societal perspective?
Yeah,
I'm playing devil's advocate, Mick. I'm not necessarily.
Yeah, no, that's fine. You're right. The 1870 Act. Let's get stuck there. The 1870 Act. If you want to get to 1944, it's the same. It starts with we've got to get our children literate and numerate. And 1944 was different. We were trying to bring in more people into the managerial class, which is why we wanted to select the literate and numerate and do better with them to create the managers that had been to replace the ones lost in the war. But excuse me, the chase to be the most successful, one of the most successful economic countries in the world does lead to the sort of PISA rankings that you mentioned a few minutes ago. PISA's played into the hands of politicians, not just in Britain, but all over the world, in the sense that this is how we can hold our schools to account. Every few years we have the PISA rankings, and we find some little crumb of comfort in the PISA rankings that we're doing better than anybody else. And the fact we've gone up from 27th to 23rd in science education seems to justify everything we've done for the last 5 years.
It's just meaningless, though, isn't it?
Well, it is meaningless, except the media jump on it. So, 2013, I think it was. I was on a plane. I was off to New Zealand to do some work for their government. I got on a plane at Heathrow on the morning that the PISA results were released, and I bought a paper at the airport, and it said UK countries plummet in PISA rankings. So it had something about all 4 UK countries. And I flew to Kuala Lumpur and got off the aeroplane for a change of flight. And walking through the airport, I saw the billboards that said Southeast Asian countries absolutely fail at PISA rankings. So I looked, and Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand had all done so badly. I got on the plane and flew to Sydney, landed in Sydney, saw in the news agency the headline there, Oceania and Australia countries Australia do really badly in the PISA rankings. And I landed in Auckland, and New Zealand were in desperate straits in the PISA rankings. And the media stoke this stuff, and the politicians know they do. And so, and they brought it on themselves, the politicians. So the whole of the globe is struggling with this. Now, it's interesting because OECD has sort of woken up to the fact that this is
human flourishing now, isn't it? There's a move.
Well, all of a sudden, they've got a project on teachers' professional identity. And what are we doing to teachers by making them chase these spurious figures that, I mean, if you ever meet anybody who did a PISA test, it's very unusual. I mean, it's a job to find one. Perhaps one of your listeners has done it. But the idea that we're all chasing some magical thing that will emerge as success is just bizarre. And it's the wrong place to start. We might be looking at different figures. You know, the number of children not in schools at the moment, the number of children who are saying compliance is not for me, and they're walking away from the education system. Yeah, you know, 1.15 million children not in school for 50% of their time. If you play with those figures, you find that that's 37 secondary schools could close for a year. That's how many children. That's how many children are out for 50% of the time. If you count the 3,000 children a year who are excluded from schools permanently, that's another couple of secondary schools. You know, we're not talking small numbers anymore. These children are saying schooling's not for us. That means the curriculum's not for them, because that's what they do in school. And people say, well, that's not about the learning and the lessons and the exams. That's about, you know, mobile phones and people not enjoying school in the sense of the rhythm of it. Well, you know, what they do in the curriculum at the school end of it is what children do all day in school. It's the lessons by all means, but it's also the events, the routines, what the school does in all sorts of environments, how the school brings learning alive for children. Until we see the whole of their learning experience as the curriculum, we'll struggle to create a national curriculum that makes any sense.
Mick, I feel like I'm talking to Matt. Matt, you've been saying something very similar.
Yeah, hey, listen, I mean, I just did a Substack post following him and Gemini. Was it Gemini? Deep research on the history of education in the UK, because I get hit quite a lot with, well, there's no research to back up your idea about hybrid school. I keep saying, well, until somebody does it, how do you get the research? How do you get the evidence?
Yeah.
But I just sat here listening to what Mick's saying and agreeing with it all. I just think in 1870, whatever it was, in 1944, it was an education system that was dictated on everybody because it was for the good of the country. And I don't think we're in an era now where you can dictate as much as you did back then. So it's interesting hearing about looking at the Oceania autonomy of teachers, because I don't feel there is much in this country. I think there's a lot of people saying we're going to do what's best for the kids now, which is great. I still feel it's a niche sort of education approach there, because most people are understandably more worried about accountability. And I just think PISA, Progress 8, Ofsted, all absolutely unfit for purpose and a load of nonsense. But yeah, one of my constant rants I've not done online, I don't think yet, is that I think the biggest issues we've got in education are politicians and the media, bizarrely, because politicians rely on the media to shape whatever they want to do. They know full well what people read it. And a lot of the stuff you read out there doesn't reflect anything that's actually happening on the ground. But I don't know what we can do about politicians and the media. I often joke that Guy Fawkes had the right idea about politicians, but it seems a bit harsh nowadays, and I could probably get arrested for that sort of joke now.
I think politicians have, they do care. I wouldn't for a minute say, they're cavalier about it, but sadly, the thing they care about most is retaining power or gaining power.
Yeah,
and because that's the only way you can get your policies into place. A couple of years ago, I had a book published which is called About Our Schools. If anybody wants to buy it, we'd love you to. We talked to Tim Brighouse and I talked to every living Secretary of State at that time for education, every living Secretary of State for education at that time. There's been plenty since, because they shuffle very rapidly. But we talked to every living one except two, and we asked them questions about how they saw the education system unfolding. The first thing that really shook us was that, well, we knew this because we could add it up, but a Secretary of State is only in power, in place, in position for about 2 years. So consequently, policy, and most of them want a policy that they're remembered for. So consequently, policy changes a lot. But 4 Secretaries of State since the sort of 1970s have made a real impact. And they were people who had been in place for a significant amount of time and made a difference. Whether you agree with the impact or not, they made impact because they were in place over time. But government has moved towards schools in a different way from what existed in pre-1970s. In the 80s, Kenneth Baker, who was Secretary of State for Education, took control of a curriculum and created the national curriculum. There hadn't been a national curriculum until then. And in doing that, he sort of walked through the gates of the school and said, we're into the schools and we're making a difference, because government didn't basically trust schools at that point. Lots of questions everywhere about schooling. So he got into the school by saying, let's sort the curriculum out. He also, during that parliament, not Kenneth Baker, but established Ofsted, which was going to look at schools in great depth. Later, when Labour got in 97, they brought in the national strategies, which were about how to teach. And that took politicians into classrooms, which was a really major thing. So Baker took them into schools. David Blunkett took them into classrooms. In recent times, Michael Gove and more Nick Gibb has taken the education system has taken the government into the children's desks, onto the children's desks and into the teachers' lives. So the things that have happened in the recent past have been about influencing not just how teachers teach, but how children will do it. So we have mathematics approaches laid out by government. How you will do subtraction is now laid out by government. And Nick Gibbs' approach to professional development for teachers was really clever, because he was very quick to pick on teacher workload and said, let's control teacher training and teacher development. And so the MPQ courses, which are run by favoured people, approved organisations, are carrying forward the agenda that government wants. So government now is controlling the agenda. And what that means is that head teachers are expected to be branch managers, teachers are expected to be operatives, and pupils are units of production. So your concept of teacher agency is limited, and now it's getting to the children. Their agency is reducing, and consequently, so many of them are saying, "Not for us, thanks." Unless they're in a really vibrant school that sort of gets across it all, you can see how people are just sort of being worn down by it. Teacher workload and tiredness and all that. It's partly.
Can I ask the question, Nick? Because last year I got a letter from a retired teacher who wrote to the school, and getting a letter is quite unusual nowadays, but she was a teacher when the national curriculum was first introduced. And she said in the letter her biggest regret was that the profession at the time did not openly rebel against it more. And I can sort of appreciate where she's coming from now. Is it time that we had, the national curriculum was never going to go, but is it time when we had such a reduced curriculum when actually it was like 50-50? So 50% of the school time was prescribed for a curriculum or something. I mean, I'd get rid of the curriculum altogether, actually, if it was up to me. But is there an argument for actually reducing significantly how much is prescribed, so actually teachers get that agency back, and schools get that freedom back? Because every school is different. You know, even little village schools in this area, the next school along is so different to ours, and the kids go there because it meets their needs, and the kids come here, but they've all got to teach the same curriculum. But it's nonsense, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things on that. The thing that's called the national curriculum rarely gets taught in full.
There's not enough time.
Well, not only that, there's not enough. What gets taught is what's tested and what's inspected and what the teacher knows about, what the teacher enjoys and what the children enjoy. So consequently, we've always had speaking and listening or oracy or a word like that in the national curriculum, but it gets less attention than reading and writing, because reading and writing are tested and speaking and listening isn't. So the danger of that is, the danger of that argument is that people say, oh, well, let's start testing speaking and listening then. And so you have regimented teaching of speaking and listening in order to get the results that are needed to maintain the school's position. And of course, what the reason that happens is because inspection is based on data, and consequently schools need to play the right game to get the right data to get the right outcomes. And in the end, you know, there's less practical science now in primary schools and in secondary schools than previously. And the reason there's less practical science is because teachers don't have time, because there's so much emphasis placed on reading, writing and mathematics, well, calculations, that they just got to keep sort of playing the game, doing what's expected and so on. I'm not a great one for working out the curriculum by time. What you have to understand is the curriculum, basically, national curriculum, is defined based on what you need for A-level and working backwards. And how do you get to that? How do you get to GCSE and A-level? But
that's interesting, because at primary school, there's almost like every primary school does 5 hours of maths and 5 hours of English a week. But when you actually look at it, the only thing that's prescribed in my Church of England primary school is RE. The rest of it, there's no time prescription at all. But for the vast majority of schools across this country, I would argue, certainly at primary level, teach 5 hours of English and 5 hours of math.
Well, actually, typically the ones I go in teach way more than that, because they call it an hour, but it's the bit before the break and the bit after the break that often is an hour and a quarter. So basically, it's the morning's gone doing English and maths. Of course, when they go to secondary, they can do maths in year 7 on a Wednesday afternoon, and they can end up doing maths on a Thursday just before they go home. The idea that you do it in the morning because you'll get it in quicker. Well, I don't know why we do it in the morning, but there we are. There must be a thing about Britain where people are better at maths in the morning.
Nick, it feels like we have a bit of an opportunity for a nice history lesson throughout our conversation.
Sorry about this.
I find it fascinating. It's topics that Matt and I have tried to unpick with other guests as well, because there's a strong argument, and you just alluded to there, which is much of the shaping of our qualification system and our curriculum was originally historically driven by universities needing to have a conformity of measure for acceptance into university. That was the kind of the structure of A-levels, and we need to have a way to measure that. And then that drifts back into, as you say, that kind of curriculum development. But as we move forward, we're seeing much more of an argument about actually it's not just what we teach and the curriculum structure, but it's also about how we choose to measure and assess. And that if we want that acceptance of those non-attending learners, if we want equity for all of our learners, there's also a conversation that the way we measure our curriculum is different. And Matt's talked many times about, the advent of micro-credentials, the thing we see as adult learners and acquiring skills. But how do you see that drifting to education policy? Are we ever going to be bold enough to step away from conformity of qualifications that sit on the landscape right now?
Well, yeah, you're right that the exam system came from the universities. Excuse me. In the way distant past, people just paid for their children to go to university. The wealthy people sent their children off to be tutored by these people in things called universities. Then there were too many of those because we got a more wealthy nation, and so people decided we needed A levels, and that was the start of it all, really. Then schools decided they needed to work out how to put the right people to A level, so they came up with what were called O levels at the time, and they're now called GCSE. GCSE is an exam for everybody, but 40% are not expected to do well because it's all done on norm referencing, which basically defeats the whole point of all the stuff we've done all the way through. So we're trying to get children to reach certain standards, but actually we don't know what the standard is until they take the exam, and then we decide which 40% haven't passed. So it's a very sort of bizarre thing. That's like sending you for beginner's width. When we find that too many can do it, we extend the width of the pool to make sure some sink. So you've got this real problem with it. Personally, I think we're on the cusp of a new age, and what I think will happen is there'll be a national curriculum that includes things like trigonometry, geometry, algebra. If you went to other countries in the world, they include trigonometry, geometry, and algebra in their national curriculums. They also include erosion, glaciation,
Oxbow Lakes, finally,
deforestation. They include density, forces, optic structures, and so on. So all countries in the world do that. At some point, one of these big tech giants will work out that they can set some examinations on all that stuff that will be global. That's a global curriculum, not a national curriculum. So they will set examinations based on criteria, based on micro-credentials, learning it any order you want. And then what will follow that is, and so there will be global qualifications, not national. And then what will follow that is teaching courses and so on that will, online AI teaching courses, which will get children qualifications in density or qualifications in focal length or whatever you want, which they'll put together to create science qualifications and so on that will be acceptable. And what will happen then is that schools will be places where relationships matter, where you teach children how to be with other people, how to do well in different contexts, and where you teach children what density really is by doing experiments on density, where you teach them what trigonometry is by doing practical work on trigonometry, so that you will see I think in not very long now, I think qualifications like GCSE and A-level will be things that we will have to work out what to do with, because children are moving towards these qualifications that are available online through this global tech giant that is creating. I mean, you just think if you've got the global A level, what do you need to go and get one?
Well, ultimately, the driver is if business respects a qualification that is provided by an organisation, an entity, then as soon as business accepts it and therefore it's something that allows the individual to progress in their professional career, that becomes the point of validity where you've got, you're trying to push sand uphill stopping that, because it's all about relevance, isn't it? Will this that I acquire open doors for me in the future? And I love that tension, or that balance is really important, because there is this access to this global qualification. There's potential that there's things that are relevant and things that perhaps are less relevant in terms of context we need to know now in the new digital age. But it almost amplifies the bit that Matt always comes back to, which is that sense of educating the child, educating the person, our social skills, resilience, creativity, all those kind of things that are, dare I say it, nurture-based rather than information-based. Is that a fair way of saying it, Matt?
Yeah, I think so. It's fascinating, the idea of global qualifications. I've never considered that really, but it's also terrifying at the same time, the thoughts of global schools, like Google schools and Microsoft schools. But then you think we're probably already heading towards that in some respect, aren't we?
Well, yeah. I mean, a lot of employers and a lot of even universities now are saying they consider less the A level and more other aspects of people's background and qualification. Lots of employers are saying they sort of park up the formal qualification bit. So maybe what you need is the qualification for what you want to do next, as opposed to the qualification that might in the future be useful.
I've spoken to some business up here, Mick, and they're very much what you say there is true. They're more interested in critical thinking, communication, natural work ethic, teamwork, environmental stewardship came up a couple of times. None of them actually are as concerned as, I mean, when I left school, you had to have a grade C in maths, English, GCSEs, or you couldn't get anywhere. But none of these businesses nowadays are that concerned about them.
It's quite a long while ago. I mean, comparative feels it. But it's quite a while ago when I was talking to employers and business leaders about what we want from youngsters leaving school, and they would call out all sorts of personal qualities. And then and you would say to them, well, these are all well and good, but what about sort of technical knowledge, information? And they get round to a few things like you need literacy and you need numeracy and you need awareness of this and awareness of that. It was a long while before you get anybody to say a GCSE or an A-level. Very rare. You get a load in a room and they'll be absolutely full of the sort of personal qualities.
Yeah, the concept of micro-credentials for those soft skills, personal qualities, power skills, whatever you want to call them, is quite interesting in that we looked at it, and I've looked at it a few times, and you have to have them accredited by certain bodies because the businesses recognise those certain bodies, but there's no actual reason that these bodies should have the sole right to accredit it, because all they've done is set themselves up and got themselves recognised, really. I just wonder if there's there's something for PISA to consider here, I think, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, there's quite a few... there's quite a call for trying to recognise, for having qualifications in interpersonal skills or work ethic or things like that. Mm-hmm. I'm always a bit nervous because I see what a mess we've made of qualifications in something as simple as mathematics or geography. And I think, why would you want to... The thing about most children leaving school believe they've only done well in a very few subjects. And I think that's a really sad thing. They come to school and have to learn all these subjects we ask them to learn. And we teach them and teach them and teach them until they feel they can't do it. You know, I meet grown-ups who say I'm no good at history and no good at maths. And I think that's ridiculous. You're not no good at it. You're just not as good as the very best people. But we sort of, in our education system, turn out many, many people who think I've had enough of learning this.
We always get in the bottom 40%, don't we, at the end of the day, Mick? That's the challenge. But also there's an argument we see in my secondary schools, and it ripples across, which is actually for engagement and success, we need a much broader curriculum. And we can't do a broad curriculum because we haven't got the capacity. But if we had a different way of delivering the curriculum, we could have breadth where children had more choices in doing subjects where they felt they could excel, or they had a personal interest, or they were potentially more relevant to employer skills. You know, those things that you've alluded to there. New employee walks in the door. Tell me about your communication skills, your creativity, your innovation, the way that you react with others. And down the list comes the tell me about your GCSE topics that you did. You know,
kids now, well, like we spoke to Year 4 girls last year and said, when should you start to take control of your own learning? And these Year 4 girls considered it for a few seconds and then said, we think around now, because we we recognise that we've got to know this, this, and this, but we also know that we like this, this, and this, and we're not really keen on that. And I thought, when have those year fours ever been consulted? This curriculum review at the moment.
We rarely see the student voice in that at sufficient level. It might feed in. Mick, I wanted to kind of come full circle back. Matt introduced at the beginning your book, which is only 3 years old now, isn't it? About our schools improving on previous best. You talked about talking with lots of secretaries of state. I know Gavin Williamson was on that list. I'm sure that was a very informative conversation. I'm being sarcastic, but tell us more about the book in the sense of where you foresee things moving that are worthy of kind of some of the highlights. What were there common themes from? Let's take the view of politically shaped but all well-intentioned secretaries of state.
Yes. I think the book was lovely to do. It was done during COVID and created lots of interest. Gavin Williamson was Secretary of State at the point where we finished the book. He was the last book one. Nadine Zahawi was the next one in. There was an irony because Gavin Williamson was quite strident about children need to behave better in schools, and then as a result of some of his...
He very well himself, did he?
Well, because of some of his indiscretions, he then had to go for anti-bullying training or something. I thought, oh, for goodness sake. But none of us are perfect. So I think one of the things that I've got high hopes for that we talk about, in that book, we talk about some foundation stones upon which the education system might move forward, and then we give lots of suggestions of where it might go after that, steps to success. But one of the things that is emerging is the concept of an open school, and the open school idea. And that was something we thought might help to really change the school system significantly. We think Tim and I thought the school system was stuck, and it was becoming too much in the control of centralised government, and we ought to look outside that. But the open school is a lovely development. It's starting to happen. Basically, in schools, you engage what we call open school tutors, who are basically learning coaches for children. And every child gets the opportunity to think, what is there beyond our school that I could enjoy, make sense of, take opportunity from, and so on. So the open school tutor points youngsters towards things in which they're interested, whether it's recreational, leisure, work experience, project work, academic work, scholarly work, things with people in their locality, across the nation, or even across the globe. We've got youngsters at the minute attached to people in universities in various parts of the world, and so on. And I think over time that will help to reshape the way schools think about their pedagogy, their teaching, think about their assessment, think about how they want children to relate, and think about the use of time. The idea that you learn between some time in the morning and some time in the afternoon, I think is a bit bizarre. Most schools realise they're contributing to children's learning, not sorting it out and not running the whole thing. So the open school development is really catching on, and I'm part of a small group of people who are trying to make it work. We're hoping to get enough momentum to go to government and say, look, the benefits in this are enormous. The benefits to children are enormous. The benefits to society in terms of saving money on health, social care, judicial costs on people who are falling out of the school system are much better, because we're helping people to make meaning from learning at a young age and seeing the way they're responding to that. So I think that's one of the big things that will come out of About Our Schools talk.
And that's quite successful in the Netherlands, isn't it? There's a group of schools in the Netherlands that does that.
Yeah. They're working really well in the Netherlands. The group of schools has got something good going. They come from a slightly different angle, but we're happy to learn from anybody. But the schools that are involved with us at the minute, doing the sort of first stage development work, are seeing real changes in the way children's attitude particularly in that early phase of secondary school, is coming through. So, the big drop-off point is years 7 and 8, 9, where children start to think, what can I do here? But they've already worked out they're in the 40% that hasn't got much chance. So attitudes are changing dramatically. And we're seeing in the schools we've got in the first stage design model are really seeing a difference in their children. So we're hoping we can make something of that.
So I guess coming full circle on that point, Mick, are you saying that you can learn maths outside of that little 40-minute window before or after lunch?
Are you saying what? Sorry, I missed it.
Earlier we were joking that you only learn your numeracy skills just before or after lunchtime. So maybe it turns out you can do it in a broader sense as well.
Well, I find it amazing that we sort of, since schooling began, we seem to think you've got to do maths in the morning. I just find it
Yeah. Well, I guess we can reflect on quite a few of these. I mean, there's a common theme that we've seen in our conversations, Matt, with many of the guests and the things we're sharing, which is an appetite to recognise the system needs to shift, but also an acknowledgement that there seems to be so many barriers that it's almost like, is it a fait accompli that this is never going to happen? Is it, taking the political perspective, always going to be tinkering around the edges of curriculum so we can have a start and finish within an electoral cycle, or a minister can get that win in terms of reform? And are we ever going to be bold enough? We often look at the countries like Estonia and others when we say, look at how they've adapted their curriculum. But they kind of had a reason. They wanted to change completely from a Soviet curriculum to something new. So they had a catalyst that we don't have. Do you ever see there being the appetite or the opportunity for us to really do a curriculum reform that isn't based on what we've already got, and how can we refine it?
I think that will
make.
Sorry, you go, Matt. You're getting ready.
No, I was asking you. I think really. So I'll hear what you say, Mick.
Well, I think that'll take a very bold government to do that. In '97, Tony Blair came to power with education, and I remember at the time the teaching population was absolutely excited about what that would mean, because at the time they thought this would mean a revision of the assessment process at the time and a revision of Ofsted. And the government, even when it got into power with a big majority, didn't quite dare do it. And that instead, over the period that they were in, it became targets, results. And we're still living with that. It would take a very strong government to put education back on the agenda as the headline, when other things, I mean, at the moment, global and economic challenges are so great that education typically is quite a long way down the list.
I think,
and if you look at Wales, there's been a massive change there in terms of trying to reform the agenda strongly, and credit to the Welsh education system. They have, since 2015, they've been working to reform the system for schooling rather than simply reform the curriculum. The curriculum has been reformed. Various aspects of teaching, leadership have been reformed. They've focused schools on what it is they should be really trying to achieve for children. But they do that against considerable question, because English politicians are endlessly criticising Welsh education system based on a PISA result, which I've already said, I've got my thoughts on PISA. But basically, you can find a result in PISA that will prove anything at the minute. And the poor Welsh, the Welsh worked so hard to make that system different. They've built a system organised by teachers and communities, for teachers and communities, and it's starting to happen. But any change is long-term. One of the problems we have in education is, you say, is there a way we could change it? It won't change overnight, and people don't have the confidence to live with things for a long while to get them to be different. They want instant change, and they want it to be right quickly.
I think
and so many people in England, so many people worry about throwing babies out with bathwaters what they forget is the baby's been in the bath so long it's wrinkled. It's
in England. It's this one way. It has to be one pathway. Why can't an education secretary have a bit of guts and by all means, stick to that one way, but just give some options. Allow hybrid schooling to get out there a bit more and support it.
Why can't we have processes which are more optional, more varied, more interreactional?
Clear evidence is what everybody wants, students especially.
The more flexibility, the harder it is to measure, and often that's the driving factor, is the measurability that we want to retain in a system that limits the one thing that everyone's crying out for, which is flexibility for context and different learners and different settings. Trying to apply the one-size-fits-all has always been the Achilles heel of any system. And I think it's not an English thing. That's a worldwide challenge that we seem to see across the education pathways. Listen, I'm really conscious. I've really enjoyed this. It's felt like we've had a history lesson and a really good edu chat. But we're kind of pretty much at the time's up bit. Matt, did you want to share anything as a wrap-up or any last question for Mick before we... How
about one last question for Mick? If you think the existing policymakers in England could learn one lesson from the past and apply it to the future, what would it be?
Good one, Matt.
It's a good question. The really big lesson is I wish we could have a national consideration of what should be the purpose of our school system, which would be based on what do we think childhood and youth should look like in our country. We've never really thought what should childhood and youth look like, and what sort of experience we want our children to have, and therefore what role do schools play in that. I think we're in a very, very interesting time regarding childhood at the minute. Childhood's a concept that only began in the late 1800s. Before then, children, as soon as you could, you got them working, and there was sort of a problem in society. If you were a family and got children, you had to hope they grew up. In the 1870s, we had the sort of schooling system, the idea of childhood. We had the nice childhood brought in, with the Prince Albert and his Christmas trees and the British Imperial Christmas Company and all that, make childhood special. And we kept childhood special through a lot of years, evacuation in the Second World War and all that. And I think we're at the moment not quite sure what childhood is. A lot of our children now see and hear things that even 10 and 20 years ago they wouldn't have. Adults talk in front of children in a way that 10 and 20 years ago they wouldn't have done. Children see things, they're privy to things in a different way. And yet at the same time we know that childhood is precious. So somehow I think if you could say what can we learn and what can we do to go forward, I think a good national debate about what's childhood and what's special about childhood. What's special about youth? Because youth is different. Adolescent is starting younger and it's lasting longer. What do children and young people need in order to grow up to be the sort of people we want them to be as a nation? I think that would be a really good debate and a better debate than, what sort of maths should they do when they're 7 or...
Very refreshing debate as well, Mick. They spend so much time focusing on what we'll do within school that perhaps the conversation needs to be more about the whole child and what they do outside of school as well, and how those two align better. That's a good way to kind of wrap up as a question that we shall be posing on the end of the notes for this podcast. Most importantly, really appreciate you giving up your time to chat with Matt and I. It's lovely to
Thank you, Mick.
Hear from, collaborate with and learn from good folks. You obviously have been doing an enormous amount in education for many, many years. So big respect from us to you, Mick. And please, we look forward to seeing you standing for Parliament and Education Secretary in the very near future. Yeah. And on that happy note, listeners, thank you. And do reach out and check out Mick's book as well, which will be in the notes as well. I have stopped the